This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle or anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is from the book of Judges, chapter 7, verses 1 to 8. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, August 16, 2026. It's part of our series called Faith Forward. So let's hear the passage beginning at Judges chapter 7, verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him got up early and camped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to hand Midian over to them. Otherwise Israel would become boastful, saying, 'My own power has saved me.' Now, therefore, come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, 'Whoever is afraid and worried is to return and leave Mount Gilead.' So 22,000 from the people returned, but then 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, 'The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. So it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go.' So he brought the people down to the water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, 'You shall put everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps in one group, and everyone who kneels down to drink in another.' Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled down to drink the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, 'I will save you with the 300 men who lapped, and will hand the Midianites over to you. So have all the other people go, each man to his own home.' So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets in their hands. And Gideon dismissed all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley." Let's start by getting up to speed on Gideon. The story about Gideon really begins in Judges chapter 6. So let's just recap a little bit of his story before we get to the part that I just read out of chapter 7. Now, the story of Gideon unfolds in the northern part of the Jordan River Valley. That's south of the Galilee. To give you some orientation to the geography here, that the Sea of Galilee is in the northern part of Israel, and the water supply there is mainly through runoff and snowmelt. And then that water leaves the Sea of Galilee flowing directly south in a river, and that river is called the Jordan River. And that river ends less than 100 miles later in the Dead Sea, where that water runs into the Dead Sea and then it evaporates. It is a closed water system. So in other words, that water, that's the snowmelt that goes to the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan, and then into the Dead Sea, none of that water ever makes it to the sea. It is a closed water system. This story happens at the northern end of the Jordan River Valley, so it's just south of the Sea of Galilee. And it's there that an angel appears to Gideon at his wine press, where he's not making wine, he's threshing wheat. Now, normally when one was threshing wheat, they would go up on a high point, like on the top of a hill or a ridge, and it's there that they would do the threshing because they were looking for wind in order to do it. They would thresh the wheat, throw it in the air, and then the chaff would blow away through the wind, but the heavier grain would come straight back down to the ground. So it was the way they separated the wheat from the chaff. The problem is he's not able to go to a high point to do this because the menacing Midianites have crossed over the Jordan River and are to the north of him. And if he were to go up on a high place, they would immediately see him. So he does so in a large round wine press. So imagine him threshing the wheat in a very small area where he could be a little bit more concealed. It's while he's doing that an angel comes to him, and in the conversation with the angel, Gideon asks the angel, why Israel is in such a crisis, and why is it that the Midianites have continued to oppress and irritate the Israelites. Well, as they continue the conversation, Gideon and the angel, Gideon is invited to lead Israel, and he kind of demurs from that. He says, I don't know if I'm really the person to do that. He says he's from one of the smallest tribes, which he is, and he's the youngest of his father's sons. So it just seems like everything's out of order. But from reading the Bible, we know that the order of birth or the size of the tribe doesn't matter at all. But what Gideon wants is for the angel to prove that he's true. So Gideon makes a sacrifice, and the angel then summons fire from heaven to consume it. So you'd think that's enough for Gideon. And the angel tells Gideon that he's going to go defeat the Midianites who have crossed over the Jordan River from its east side. Now the point becomes clear with the next instruction. Now Gideon now believes that this is truly an angel of the Lord. The angel tells him to go get 2 bulls and prepare to sacrifice them. But here's something we kind of learned coincidentally along the way. Gideon is supposed to tear down his father's altar to Baal and the Asherah pole that is sitting next to it. So what we didn't know until now is that Gideon's father has been a worshiper of Baal. Not of Yahweh, not of Israel's God, but to the same God that the Canaanites and even the Moabites worship and serve, although through a slightly different name. And perhaps this is the answer to Gideon's question, why are the Israelites afflicted by the Moabites? Well, perhaps because they are engaged in acts of idolatry. So as the story unfolds in chapter 6, Gideon takes 10 of his servants to tear down this altar and the Asherah pole. The fact that Gideon has 10 servants implies that his family had a good deal of wealth. So Gideon is not coming from an impoverished household. He tears down this altar, and when he does so and then offers sacrifices to Yahweh, or Israel's God, on a new altar built on top of it, the people who live around there want Gideon killed. And so they go complain to Gideon's father, a guy named Joash. Now Joash tells them to leave his son alone, and asks them a rhetorical question. He says, well, if you're so interested in having this altar to Baal and an Asherah pole, do you really want to contend for Baal? And so because of this, his father, Gideon's father, gives him a new name. His name is Gideon, but gives him this new name that has to do with this episode. And it's Jerub-Baal. And it literally means the one who contends with Baal. In other words, the one that kind of fights with, if you will. And so the story then begins to frame a little bit better where the Midianites are and where they've come from in Judges 6. They cross the Jordan and they camp on the north side of a valley. And the valley is called the Valley of Jezreel. And so they're on the northern side of that. And Gideon is on the south side of that valley on Mount Gilboa, looking across the valley to the north. And so if you were to imagine, Gideon standing on top of this mountain, he's looking down in a valley across at the Midianites, and to his right, you see the Jordan River flowing from north to south to his right as he's facing north. Now, it says in the story in Judges 6 that Gideon gathers an army of 32,000 men, which is still far short of the numbers of the Midianites. So his faith is a little bit shaky. He's already asked the angel of the Lord to prove who he is. He's been obedient to destroy the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole. And so even after all of this, there's a recognition that his family has been worshiping Baal for who knows how long. So his whole interaction with Yahweh, or Israel's God, is a completely new experience for him. And so at the end of chapter 6, we have the very famous story of Gideon asking God to prove who he is with the fleece. You might remember he puts a fleece out at night, and then God comes and makes the fleece wet, but the ground around it dry. And then Gideon then asks for a second time for God to do this, but in the inverse way, to put the fleece on the ground. But now the fleece would remain dry, but the ground around it would be covered with dew. It's interesting that chapter 6 doesn't really end with a resolution to that story. It just describes what happens, and then it moves right on into chapter 7. All this opens a key passageway to us, though, and it's this: that faith comes gradually, in fits and spurts, not all at once. Faith is sometimes misunderstood as a binary thing. Either it's on or it's off. Either you have it or you don't. And Scripture teaches us something very different. That faith is formed gradually over time. God's faithfulness is pure and consistent, but our faithfulness, our faith in God, it takes time to overcome our inner doubts and fears, hesitations even. So Gideon asks for a test after a test after a test for God to prove who he is. And God is going to end up taking Gideon through the same process, but in a different sort of way. So the question we might ask of our own faith as we read the story of Gideon is, what is our next step of faith? What is God inviting us into next? And it's a question of what now? Not what then, not later, but now. What's the next step that our faith needs to take right now to move more and more and more into that deeper relationship with the Lord? And now we turn to Judges 7 proper, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 3 first. And this has to do with really discerning the heart. Now, Gideon asks God to prove his will with the holy fleece that we just talked about. The fleece is wet, then it's dry. And so as chapter 7 opens, there's no reference to that test at all, and about how the fleece and the testing of the fleece resolves itself. God performs, but it doesn't really say what its implication is. So the writer begins chapter 7 by naming Gideon as Jerubbaal. Remember, that's his name his father gives him, which means to contend with Baal. But then it's almost like recognizing the mistake. The writer changes it immediately. He says, no, that's Gideon. Now there were the 32,000 men, soldiers there with Gideon when he arose early on the south side of the valley of Jezreel. Remember, the valley is what separates Gideon from the Midianites. The Midianites are across the valley to the north. He's on the south side of the valley. He's at a higher peak than the Midianites are. So he's looking a little bit down the mountain toward them. And it says they decided to make their camp at a spring. And the spring name there is the spring of Harod. Now, the spring of Harod, the word Harod in Hebrew, it means trembling. So it literally says the spring of trembling. And in many ways, it represents what's going to transpire in Gideon's men and even himself as they stare down the Midianites across the valley. The Midianites are camped just to the north. They can see the entire army arrayed. They know exactly what they're up against. So God speaks to Gideon there and tells him the exact opposite of what he wants to hear. You see, even with 32,000 men, Gideon is vastly outnumbered. It's clear, just based on numbers, that Gideon can't win. But then Yahweh, God, asks him to do something so strange. God says, the people with you are too many. And the text says, otherwise Israel will become boastful, saying, my own power has saved me. So there's a notion here that with 32,000 men, it would be easier, I think, for the Israelites to say that they defeated the Midianites if they were able to do so and to take credit for it. And so the test Gideon has given God now yields a test that he himself must endure. Gideon tested God with the angel of the Lord consuming the sacrifice that was offered, the fleece that Gideon continued to put out, asking it for it to be wet and for it to be dry. These things all kind of come back through the cycle. So it's that Gideon has to endure this test that's coming so that he and the Israelites cannot take credit for about what's going to happen. So the Lord tells them to announce to everybody, anybody who's afraid and worried, you should go back to the camp. And certainly that would have included Gideon, but he's obviously excluded. So out of the 32,000 men that came ready to fight, 22,000 of them returned to the main camp. Not their home yet, just the camp. So now Gideon has 10,000 men to face the Midianites. And that opens another key passageway for us. The Lord continually works to make us face our own limitations. The Lord continually works to make us face our own limitations. With Gideon, God sends away 22,000 fighting men who feel, quite likely, exactly the same way as he does. So with all of the testing Gideon has done of God, now the tables are turned to test him. Will he have faith in a God who will deliver him? You see, God's always at work in us and in our communities, rooting out all which hinders his love for us and with us. God is determined to make us into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. And it's painful at times going through that process, much like what Gideon goes through in this story. However, ultimately, it is for our benefit and for our glory. Let's look at verses 4 through 8, which is a different kind of discernment. It's a discernment of the practice. Now, the Lord speaks to Gideon again to tell him that there's still too many people. You remember why? That Israel could easily take credit for any victory they might have over the Midianites, saying that it was of their doing. So God directs Gideon to a test to see who will go with him against the Midianites. The people were told to go down to the water of the spring, remember the spring that they've gathered near, and those that place their face down into the water and drink, those are excluded. But those that kneel and cup their hands to bring water up to their mouth are included. So there's lots of conjecture about the meaning of the test. There are commentators who say, well, the difference here is that the men who lapped water directly out of the spring, they had their heads down, they weren't looking around, they were vulnerable to attack. Those that knelt were able to look around and see what was happening as they drank their water. It could be that, they drank their water like dogs would drink water. As a matter of fact, it says dogs in the text. What I would say to you is that these interpretations are novel for preaching. I've heard some of these things before in sermons, but the text isn't clear about that. The text doesn't offer us any interpretation. It just says what it says. So who knows? So a lot of these, kind of gyrations we go through to figure out what this means or that means is just reading into the text probably what's not there. In some ways, the test is a bit arbitrary because the whole point of the test is to winnow the number down from 10,000 to whatever that number is going to be. Well, we learn when we read the story that number is actually 300. 300 men. 9,700 are sent back to the camp. And so verse 7 in Judges chapter 7 says that the Lord will take those 300 and God is going to use them to save everyone. And now the rest are sent home. They're not just in the camp. They're all sent home. The 300, though, before they left, took all the provisions that the other men had brought that they would need, and especially took all of their trumpets. And if you keep reading the story, you'll figure out why 300 trumpets becomes important. So Gideon let the men return, and he gathered with the 300. And that's a final key passageway for us. That God sees and knows the outcome and must be trusted with it. God sees and knows the outcome and must be trusted with it. We're kind of an outcome-oriented people. What's the goal? What's the end game? What are we trying to get accomplished? And our obsession with these questions can sometimes get in the way. Not all the time, but sometimes. Can get in the way of what God is doing in our midst. God holds the future and the outcomes related to it. So it's not our work to worry about this. Gideon is learning to trust God to lead him. He certainly does exactly that with what happens as the story continues. Gideon leads his soldiers on a raid in the middle of the night where they go into the camp of the Midianites while they're all sleeping and they smash pitchers together that crack and crush and make a breaking sound, and then they blow their 300 trumpets. The Midianites all come out of their tents in the middle of the night, all asleep. They're not wearing their armor. They're not dressed. They don't know who's who, and they end up killing each other. And so the story unfolds in a way in which God knows the outcome, but has to be trusted with it. So we have to learn to do the same thing. We have to learn to let go of the outcome and trust those outcomes to God. Our work, the work that God calls us to do, is to be faithful in the moment right before us, right now. Not what's next, what's right now. I want to thank you for listening to the FFMC podcast. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them all right here in the FFMC podcast. Also, encourage you to visit our website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.